Greetings, students. Welcome to week 2 of the History of Modern Philosophy. I'm glad you could join us. This video is going to provide some background on Descartes' work, some historical background, and some intellectual background. So we'll end up with 3 videos for week 2. There will be this background video, then there will be a video covering Descartes' first meditation, and then another video covering the second meditation. So let's start simple here. So Descartes was born in 1596 in France, in the Touraine region. He was born near the town of Le Hay, and Le Hay has been renamed Descartes since then. So Descartes was born near Descartes, although it wasn't called that when he was born there. Okay, I've already mentioned probably he died in 1650. I have not mentioned that he died under somewhat odd circumstances. He was still productive, still young for a philosopher. He was in his 50s. He was writing a lot. He was corresponding a lot. The Queen of Sweden invited him to Sweden to tutor her. So he went there. He was being woken up, at 4 or 5 a.m. every morning. He was used to getting up at noon. It was bad for his health being in Sweden and not getting enough sleep. So he got sick a couple months after he got there and died shortly thereafter from pneumonia, apparently. Right? So if the Queen of Sweden asks you to tutor her, you might want to say no. All right, well, I just like to start off with fun stuff. But let's think a bit about the importance of Descartes here. There are a lot of books still being written on Descartes and on Cartesian themes. He's sometimes called the father of modern philosophy. Why is that? I would say there are a few main reasons. Let me state 3 of them, so that might be helpful. First of all, there's Descartes' emphasis on epistemology. Right, so he's very keen on figuring out what we can know, how we can know it. This is a new emphasis, obviously. Well, depending on how much you know about philosophy, I guess. For some of us, obviously, Plato and Aristotle cared a lot about epistemology. Medieval philosophers cared a great deal about epistemology. The difference is, it does seem like epistemological questions are really driving Descartes' philosophy, right? The main questions really seem to be epistemological. It's a sign of the times, it seems, right? So there's some idea in the air that there's a new way of learning about the world, right? It's coming from Copernicus and Galileo. We'll say more about both of them here in a minute. So science, modern science, is coming into being. It doesn't exist yet, right? And so people like Descartes and also Francis Bacon, whose readings from him in our textbook, are trying to figure out, what is this new way of knowing the world, right? And so that seems to be why Descartes is driven by epistemological questions. He realizes something new is happening in human knowledge, and basically he's trying to codify it. Same with Francis Bacon, although they seem to go in somewhat different directions. with that. Okay, so I said I'd say three things about why Descartes really stands out as the father of modern philosophy. Another thing is mind-body dualism, right? So Descartes eventually, maybe you've read it by now, right? This happens in the second meditation. Eventually says, I am essentially a thinking thing. You know, he says, I'm a thinking thing, but the context in which he says it makes it clear that he's saying, that's my essence. That's the most important attribute I have. It's the defining attribute. So I might have a body, but that's somewhat accidental, right? So we'll go through this argument in a different video, but basically he ends up saying, necessarily, I have a mind. That's the kind of being I am. Possibly I have a body, right? And so the mind and the body, they just happen to come together. Maybe God willed it, and that's why it's so. But minds aren't caused by bodies. In the way that we tend to think is true in the modern world, we tend to think, well, the mind is caused by the brain. Isn't that clear? Well, that's not Descartes' view, and in fact, mind-body dualism is still with us in a lot of ways, right? We still often think about mind and body, even mind and brain, as separate, as different, as having different essences. So again, we'll get into that more later, but that certainly is another reason Descartes sticks out as the father of modern philosophy. He got us started on this dualist track that philosophy has had a hard time recovering from. Or if you're a dualist, you think he got us on this dualist track, and hey, we're still on it, isn't it great? But actually in the 20th century, a lot of philosophers worked on getting us past a dualism somehow or other. So that's part of the legacy from Descartes. And then finally, this is what I wanted to focus on in this video. Descartes really secularized science, so I said secularization would be a theme in this course. So as you read the Meditations, you'll notice that he insists that we shouldn't talk about God's intentions or goals when we're doing science. So Descartes sees the universe as mechanical, as a sort of machine. And this is new and this is different, right? So the ancients tended to see the universe as organistic, in other words, as alive. So if you go back and you read Plato's Timaeus, for instance, you'll see Plato talking about the universe as a living organism. The Christian philosophers didn't think of it as an autonomous machine. They did think of it as God's handiwork. By the time you get to Descartes, now it's an autonomous machine. It works on its own. Descartes isn't totally clear and emphatic about that, but it's there, right? And so then that paves the way for Newton, Isaac Newton, who certainly was clear and explicit about it, certainly saw the universe as a machine that can run on its own. God just set it into motion and off it goes. And then, as you probably know, that's the deist conception of God as a creator, right? And so a lot of people that we call the founding fathers, they had this deist conception, and it starts with Descartes in a sense, reaches a certain height in Newton, and then influences the views of the people who set this country up politically, right? So there's an interesting trajectory there. So clearly Descartes important for reasons that go beyond philosophy. Okay, so speaking of the secularization of science, now in the Middle Ages, particularly I should say in the late Middle Ages, Aristotle really ruled the roost in a sense. You know, Aristotle lived from 384 to 322 BCE, right? I mentioned this last week. He lived in the 300s BCE, the 4th century. So he's been dead a long time, right? When Descartes writes the Meditations. However, there's this interesting story here about Aristotle's works, right? So you've got the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 400s AD, right? Still way before Descartes' time. So the Western Roman Empire collapses. Plato's works survive in the Western world through the work of monks, mainly, who kept copying them down. Aristotle's works, however, were lost from Western Europe. They continued to exist in the Byzantine Empire, which is basically the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Now, the Byzantine Empire lasted until 1453, as you may recall. That's when Constantinople was sacked. Now, the Byzantine Empire was run in Greek, right? So Greek was the official language of the government. It was easier for them to maintain Plato's and Aristotle's works and a lot of other works that we still read today, at least in philosophy departments. So, interestingly, in the late Middle Ages, Aristotle was being translated into Arabic. You might also recall that basically Islam was up and coming, starting in the late 700s, 800s, going forward from there. You've got basically an Islamic empire growing, outward from Saudi Arabia. I'm not going to get into the politics of how that worked exactly. But certainly you've got a culturally cohesive empire, right, with different political units, let's say. And science and scholarship is surging in that part of the world, right? They're interested in Aristotle. There are lots of Arabic commentaries on Aristotle. So, you got the Byzantines preserving the Greek, right? But they're pretty far over there in Turkey. So these Muslim scholars basically get really interested in Aristotle. They translate Aristotle into Arabic. These Arabic texts start moving westward, right? So the south of Spain, for instance, was part of an Islamic caliphate in the late Middle Ages, right? So these texts by Aristotle, they were translated into Arabic. They move into the European university system via the Islamic Empire. I don't know if I should call it that, but again, a culturally cohesive unit, right? Even if there were different political units that made it up. So you get Thomas Aquinas, who lived from 1225 to 1279, right? That's the late Middle Ages. That's why I'm stating the dates. I'm just trying to situate him for you. Thomas Aquinas wrote really important commentaries on Aristotle, and not only commentaries, but did his own work, right? where he basically ended up founding Catholic theology, or refounding Catholic theology, if you like, on Aristotelian philosophy, right? So he does this really key work for the Catholic Church. They didn't ask for it, but like I said, he's refounding Catholic theology, trying to put it on what he considers to be the best philosophical footing it could be on. And then Aquinas is made a doctor of the Church after that. So what that means is, right, if he's a doctor of the Church, that means his work is canonical. It doesn't exactly have the same status as the Bible, but if the Catholic Church says he's a doctor, that basically means, look, what Aquinas says is the correct view. If you want to know what the doctrines of the Catholic Church are, read Aquinas. So Aquinas ties Catholic doctrine to Aristotelian philosophy in this very strong way, and then the Catholic Church says that's our official doctrine. So that helps to explain some of what I alluded to last week. You know, Descartes really nervous about his own work. So first of all, you have Nicolaus Copernicus, who was born in Royal Prussia, which is a province of the Kingdom of Poland. Okay, so Copernicus, as I think you must know, put forward the view of heliocentrism. The sun is at the center of the solar system. He put it forward in a really strong way with a lot of empirical data, right? So he has all this data from really great observations. He and Tycho Brahe worked together. They had a really good telescope they were working with, you know, because now we're into the Renaissance when we look at Copernicus. So his dates are 1473 to 1543. So didn't have a modern telescope like Galileo did, but a really good observatory, all the best technology of the day, great observations, and all of this led Copernicus to believe heliocentrism makes more sense than geocentrism. Mathematically speaking, looking at the data, it makes more sense to put the sun at the center of the universe. That was how Copernicus was looking at it, than it does to put the earth at the center. Right? So Copernicus does this really important empirical work. Galileo is strongly influenced by it. Galileo builds a handheld telescope based on working knowledge of optics that Copernicus didn't have. Galileo literally sees things that Copernicus couldn't see, including the moons around Jupiter. Now that was in 1610. So in 1610, Galileo sees with his own eyes the 4 biggest moons of Jupiter. That's a huge deal, right? If Jupiter has moons, then at least the specific theory of geocentrism that we had been working with is wrong, right? Because that theory says the whole universe is built around the Earth, so everything is going around the Earth. So moons around Jupiter doesn't fit in with that, right? And you know, religiously speaking, what's the point of moons around Jupiter that humans can't even see with the naked eye, right? I mean, the whole idea of the solar system in the Middle Ages was, well, we're at the center. This is all for our edification, right? The heavens was built by God as something for us to look at and appreciate maybe edify us in ways we're not aware of and don't understand. But moons going around Jupiter that we can't even see, right? That just doesn't fit in with the spirit of, geocentrism as the Christians understood it. And then, more empirically speaking, more theoretically speaking, well, isn't the Earth sitting at the center of these celestial spheres that hold the bodies in place? So how could there be these moons around Jupiter? It doesn't fit with what was known. So, it's one thing for Copernicus to say, oh, the data really supports heliocentrism better, but then for Galileo to actually make these observations about Jupiter's moons, that really blows up geocentrism in a way. And then I should also tell you, Galileo worked hard to make quantitative science respectable, right? Aristotle made a choice. It wasn't an accident. Aristotle made a choice. He thought science should be qualitative. He was reacting against Plato and Pythagoras, who came before him. If you look at Plato's Timaeus, or Timaeus, the text that I already mentioned, you'll see that Plato depends quite a bit on geometry and mathematics in explaining how the solar system works, right? And then Aristotle thought that was not the way to go. He moved away from a quantitative understanding of the solar system and said that science should be qualitative, it should be descriptive. And then Aquinas, as I've said, made Aristotle's views foundational for the Catholic Church, right? So Galileo is pushing on quantitative science. So for instance, he is able to say in mathematical terms how bodies accelerate while they're falling. That's something that Galileo is famous for, so hopefully you've heard something about that, right? He realized that falling bodies accelerate at a uniform rate, not at different rates depending on their weight, right? He's known for that. He's famous for that, right? And he came up with a mathematical formula for how that works. He gave us a quantitative understanding of how bodies fall toward the earth, right? But by insisting on quantitative science, he's undermining Aristotle. And in undermining Aristotle, he's undermining the theoretical underpinnings of Catholic doctrine, right? So no wonder he ended up under house arrest, right? So he's pushing on quantitative science, he's pushing on heliocentrism, right? And the Catholic Church isn't having it. And so I think I gave you the year last week, but I'll say it again. Galileo was put under house arrest in 1633. And what I didn't say is that, or I don't think I did, Descartes is working on a system of physics when Galileo is put under house arrest. So Descartes was working on a book called The World or The Universe, depending on how you want to translate it. And this book argued for heliocentrism, as Galileo had done, right? So Descartes is coming after Copernicus, after Galileo's most important work, and is building on it and is trying to put forward this heliocentric view. And then Galileo is put under house arrest, right? And so, that scares Descartes. And so this will sound odd, but the story is he tried to destroy his manuscript. And you might think, well, what do you mean he tried to destroy? Well, he threw it in the fire, However, what you have to understand is, and this story might be apocryphal anyway, but if we want to make sense of the story, you have to understand that, everything was written down multiple times, usually, if you were working on a book, right? What it would have been normal to do is for Descartes to write up his thoughts, but then also to write copies of chapters and send them out to other scholars and to see what they thought. So that might be what happened, although again the story might be fake. But the story is he threw it all in the fire, but it was already circulating. And so we do have a copy of the book, right? So if you go look at Descartes' complete works, you could read it if you want to. But in any case, he got scared by what happened to Galileo, and so he tried to abandon that project, right? And I have explained this part. The discourse seems very abstract, as do the meditations. Descartes is trying not to make very specific statements about what the solar system is like. He's actively trying to avoid making such specific statements, and he wants to concentrate on method and epistemology. How do we know, right? In the hopes that, right, if his thoughts about method and epistemology catch on, then people will come to see that heliocentrism is the correct view. But he doesn't want to argue for it directly anymore. When he writes the discourse and when he writes the meditations, it's too much trouble. He doesn't want to be under house arrest. Okay, so Descartes is also pushing on quantitative science, right? Clearly. As a matter of fact, let's think about how the text works a little bit. In the first meditation, as early as the first meditation, Descartes certainly suggests that the parts of the world that can be described with mathematics, with geometry, are the most knowable parts. Also, already in the discourse, which comes before the meditations, Descartes said, you have to proceed from what you clearly and distinctly perceive. It's clear in the meditations that what we clearly and distinctly perceive about the world are the parts of it that we can understand mathematically and geometrically. So these points come together to suggest that what we really know about the world is the way that it expresses and reflects mathematical and geometrical truths, right? The other stuff that we observe that can't be handled or formulated mathematically, we don't know that stuff as well. It's less clear to us and we're not sure about it. So that kind of puts things on its head in a way, because if you're Aristotle, you think, well, we know the world through observation, and then maybe some of those observations are amenable to mathematical treatment, but then some of them aren't, so it's not appropriate to use mathematics as the language of science, right? That would be Aristotle's view. And then, like I said, this is turned on its head by Descartes, right? Descartes' view is, okay, so you observe the world, but it's a big fuzzy mess. Some parts of it are mathematical or can be mathematically formulated, right? And then those are the parts that we really know about. And the other observations that we can't treat mathematically, forget about them. They're not clear enough, right? So that's Descartes' view. That emerges in the meditations. And then, of course, it's easy to see that, well, that supports what Copernicus and Galileo were doing. Not accidentally, of course. Right? So this has all come full circle in a way. And I should say, I think I've at least hinted at this before, Descartes was a good mathematician, right? So he's got his own work in mathematics to support what he's doing. What he seemed to be especially good at was using algebra to solve geometric problems and using geometry to solve algebraic problems, right? And given that interest, given that strength, it's not surprising to say, or shouldn't be surprising for you to hear, that he developed the Cartesian coordinate system, right? You know, the grid that you studied in geometry, and you know, you'd write down, I don't have a marker board or a chalkboard here, unfortunately. Maybe I should install one in the office. But you remember a grid laid out before you, and you'd write y equals x squared minus 4, right? You remember what that looked like. You'd end up with a hyperbola going upside down, right? So what does that tell you? Just that the Cartesian coordinate system is a translation device. You feed it algebra and you get possibly a hyperbola, but you know, depending on the formula, you get different figures, right? So that helps to understand Descartes, thinking about the Cartesian coordinate system. So we'll leave it at that as far as Descartes' mathematical and scientific credentials go. I'll say one more thing by way of background. So Descartes was taught by the Jesuits, as I believe we've mentioned. And if you read the preface to the Meditations, which actually isn't in our textbook, but you could easily find it online if you wanted to read it, there's a prefatory letter where he dedicates the Meditations, and it's dedicated to the theology faculty at the Sorbonne. You've probably heard of the Sorbonne. It's a really famous university in France. It's still well known. There's still a lot of good work done there. So the theology faculty at the Sorbonne, they were Jesuits, right? So Descartes was taught by Jesuits at La Flèche, and then he dedicates the Meditations to the Jesuits at the Sorbonne. Okay, so he's heavily influenced by them. He wants them to like his work, so he dedicated it to them. By the way, they didn't want to teach it. They didn't want to teach the Meditations. They were skeptical of it. And they could see the connection to what Galileo had been doing. They weren't naive, right? So Descartes' work wasn't taught by Jesuits until after Descartes was dead. Anyway, the style of the Meditations has a lot to do with Saint Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Jesuit order. Now, he wrote a book called Spiritual Exercises, and that book is sort of casually, informally written, and Ignatius divides it into these meditations that are supposed to take place on different days. Does that sound familiar? And it, like I said, it's casual and informal, so Ignatius doesn't mind speaking in the first person. Let's be casual, let's interact, let's be intimate, you know. That's kind of the style of Ignatius. So that's what the Meditations is like, right? So Descartes even copied the style of Saint Ignatius of Loyola, who again founded the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, right? Ignatius was the founder. So the Meditations comes off as kind of casual and breezy. Sometimes there's actually a lot of technical work going on, but it can read like somebody's diary, right? You might have already started reading it. You might have noticed that. Now Descartes had his own reasons for writing in the first person, right? So in the second meditation, the climax, I would say, of the second meditation is this proposition, I am, I exist, is completely certain whenever thought or uttered by me, right? Or, from your own point of view, by you, right? So whenever that proposition is stated or thought, I am, I exist, it must be true. It's necessarily true. So we've gone through all this doubt, and then we find certainty in the proposition, I am, I exist. But it has to be in the first person. If I say Descartes exists, well, that's false. I mean, he died, right? So it's I am, I exist. If I say it, then I'm obviously here to say it, so it must be true, right? So on the one hand, this casual style was copied from St. Ignatius of Loyola, but then on the other hand, Descartes really needed to state his most important finding, certainly one of his most important findings, in the first person. It can't really be stated in the third person. Okay, well, that's a lot of background. I meant to make the video shorter. I've already warned you. I'm not good at being brief or concise. But here we are. I hope that was helpful. Thanks for watching.